What if the most powerful military on earth just quietly admitted it cannot win? Not with a speech, not with a press conference, but with a single word: cancel. Before we go further, if this story matters to you, hit that like button right now because it genuinely helps this video reach more people who need to understand what's happening in the Middle East today. Subscribe if you're new, turn on notifications, and if you know someone who still thinks this war is a simple, one-sided story, send this to them. Trust me, by the end of this video, you will see this conflict completely differently. Let's rewind for a second, because to understand how strange this moment is, you need to understand how it started. On the 28th of February, 2026, the United States and Israel launched a coordinated wave of airstrikes across Iran. This was not a small operation. It was a full assault on military bases, government buildings, and command centers. And in the middle of that first night, Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, was assassinated. Along with him, a long list of senior Iranian officials and military commanders were also killed. Think about that for a moment. This wasn't a warning shot. This wasn't a limited strike meant to send a message. This was an attempt to cut the head off the snake in a single night, in a single operation. And for a few days, it looked like it might work. Iranian air defenses were caught off guard. Military installations were hit one after another. American officials and a lot of Western media were already talking about the collapse of the Iranian regime. Some pundits were predicting that within weeks, maybe even days, Iran's government would fall apart from the inside. But Iran did something almost nobody expected. It didn't collapse. It didn't panic. It didn't run to the negotiating table begging for mercy. Instead, it reached for the one card it had been holding for decades, the card that every military planner in Washington had war-gamed 100 times, but never fully believed Iran would actually play. The Strait of Hormuz. If you don't know why this narrow strip of water matters so much, here's the simple version. Nearly a fifth of the entire world's oil supply passes through that strait every single day. Tankers from Saudi Arabia, from the UAE, from Kuwait, from Iraq, almost all of them have to sail through this one narrow channel to reach the rest of the world. And starting in early March, Iran declared that channel closed. Not closed on paper. Closed with mines. Closed with fast attack boats seizing cargo ships. Closed with drones and missiles, targeting tankers that tried to pass without Iran's permission. Within days, the price of oil around the world started climbing, and countries that had nothing to do with this war suddenly found themselves paying the price for it at the gas pump. This is the moment the story stopped being a regional conflict and became a global one. Now, here's where it gets even more interesting. On the 9th of March, President Trump stood in front of cameras and said something bold. He said the war was, in his words, very complete, and that the Iranian military had been destroyed. He even talked about the United States taking control of the strait itself. But here's the problem. Reality did not agree with that statement, because just weeks later, the United States was forced to launch an entirely new military campaign, one specifically designed to reopen a waterway that had supposedly already been reopened. If the war was really finished in March, why did American and Israeli jets need to spend the following months bombing Iranian naval targets just to keep ships moving through Hormuz? That gap between what was said and what actually happened on the ground is the heart of this entire story. By April, the fighting had become so intense and so expensive that both sides agreed to a ceasefire. On the 8th of April, mediated by Pakistan, the United States and Iran paused the shooting. It was framed as a step toward peace. In reality, many analysts believe it was something else entirely, a chance for the United States to catch its breath. Because here's a fact that rarely gets mentioned on mainstream news. Modern warfare runs on munitions, and munitions are not unlimited. Precision missiles, guided bombs, interceptor systems, all of it has to be manufactured, stockpiled, and replaced. And after more than a month of non-stop strikes, American forces were reportedly burning through their supply far faster than anyone had planned for. You cannot bomb your way to victory if you run out of bombs. So, when the ceasefire held, and when a formal memorandum of understanding was signed in mid-June, a lot of people breathed a sigh of relief. Finally, they thought, this nightmare is over. It wasn't. Before we continue, let's pause for something different. If you've made it this far, you're clearly someone who actually wants to understand the world, not just scroll past it. So do me a favor. Drop a single word in the comments right now, just your honest reaction to what you've heard so far. I read every single one, and it genuinely shapes what I cover next. Now, back to the story. The Memorandum of Understanding signed in June was supposed to end the war within 60 days. It laid out a path to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, to de-escalate military operations, and to move toward some kind of lasting settlement. For a moment, the world exhaled, but peace built on unresolved anger rarely lasts. In early July, Iran struck 3 commercial vessels that had tried to bypass the shipping routes Tehran had set for the strait. President Trump responded almost immediately, declaring that, as far as he was concerned, the truce was over. Within days, the fighting resumed, and this time it escalated even further than before. By mid-July, the funeral of Ali Khamenei was still drawing massive crowds across Tehran, crowds chanting slogans against both the American president and the Israeli prime minister. A new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, had technically taken over, but for days he remained almost completely out of public view, a detail that only added to the sense of chaos and uncertainty inside Iran's leadership. Meanwhile, the United States shifted strategy again. On the 13th of April, even before the July collapse, Washington had already imposed a full naval blockade on Iran, aiming to cut off its ports entirely. American officials claimed this blockade was costing Iran roughly $500 million every single day. Ships were being intercepted. Some were seized outright. And yet, even with all of that pressure, Iran kept finding ways around it. Reports suggest dozens of vessels still managed to slip past the blockade, and trade routes running through other regional partners continued to move goods in and out of the country. This is what makes this war so different from anything the United States has fought in the last 20 years. Iran isn't trying to defeat America in open battle. It doesn't need to. All it needs to do is make the cost of this war so unbearable, so expensive, so endless, that the other side eventually decides it isn't worth it anymore. And that strategy appears to be working. Now let's talk about right now, because this is where the story becomes almost unbelievable. As of the 1st of August, 2026, President Trump publicly announced that he was canceling planned strikes on Iran, citing what he called progress in negotiations. This came just one day after American officials had suggested that new strikes could happen as early as that very weekend. The State Department, at almost the exact same time, issued a fresh warning urging American citizens across the Middle East to consider leaving immediately. Read those two things together for a second. On one hand, the administration is telling its own citizens the region is dangerous enough that they should get out now. On the other hand, the president is saying strikes are being called off because a deal might be close. That is not the language of a side that feels confident. That is the language of a side trying to manage a situation that has spiraled far beyond what anyone predicted back in February. And the chaos on the ground backs this up. Just hours before that announcement, Kuwaiti air defense systems were activated to shoot down Iranian drones targeting critical facilities. A tanker was struck near the Strait of Hormuz, close to the coast of Oman. Iran's own military command issued a statement accusing the United States of, in their words, fanning the flames of a full-scale regional war, and specifically warning countries that host American bases that they could be dragged into the fighting too. This is not a war winding down. This is a war holding its breath. So let's ask the real question everyone is avoiding. If the United States really had the overwhelming advantage everyone expected back in February, why does it keep needing new ceasefires? Why does it keep announcing victory, only to return to bombing weeks later? Why is the president canceling strikes and talking about deals instead of declaring the mission accomplished? There's a term some geopolitical analysts use for this pattern, and it's called an escalation trap. It works like this. One side starts a war expecting a quick, decisive win. When that win doesn't come fast enough, they escalate, hoping more pressure will finally force the other side to break. But the other side doesn't break. Instead, they absorb the pressure and respond with just enough force to keep the fight going without ever giving their opponent the clean victory they need. Slowly, the side that escalated finds itself trapped, unable to walk away because that would look like defeat, but unable to keep escalating forever because the cost keeps climbing. Many experts argue that is exactly where the United States finds itself today. If you're starting to see how deep this really goes, make sure you're subscribed, because we are only halfway through unpacking what this means, not just for the Middle East, but for the entire global balance of power. Stick with me. Let's zoom out now, because this war isn't just about Iran and the United States. It's reshaping alliances and rivalries all over the world, and most people watching the headlines have no idea how big those ripple effects actually are. Start with the Gulf states. For decades, countries like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, and Bahrain built their entire security strategy around one core idea, that hosting American military bases would guarantee their protection. That was the deal. Let the United States operate freely from our soil, and in return, we are shielded from regional threats. This war has quietly shattered that assumption. Instead of being protected, several of these bases became targets. Iranian drones and missiles struck facilities across the region throughout this conflict, and the very alliance that was supposed to provide safety instead turned these nations into frontline targets in a war they didn't start. Kuwait alone has had to activate emergency air defense systems multiple times just in the last few days to intercept incoming drones. Put yourself in the position of a Gulf leader right now. You watched your closest ally promise protection, and instead, your ports, your cities, your people became exposed to attacks that never would have reached you otherwise. What does that do to trust? What does that do to future decisions about who you align with? Many analysts believe we are watching the early stages of a major recalibration across the region, where Gulf nations quietly begin hedging their bets, building closer economic and diplomatic ties with China, seeking security guarantees that don't come with the risk of being caught in America's next confrontation. And that brings us to China and Russia, the two powers watching this entire war from the sidelines with what can only be described as quiet satisfaction. Neither country wants a stronger Iran that threatens regional stability, but both of them have a much bigger interest at play. Every missile America fires in the Middle East is a missile it isn't saving for a potential confrontation over Taiwan. Every dollar spent on this war is a dollar not spent modernizing forces positioned against Russia in Eastern Europe. Every week, the United States remains. Bogged down chasing a decisive victory over Iran is a week where Washington's attention, resources, and political capital are pulled away from the two countries it considers its most serious long-term rivals. There have been persistent reports and widespread suspicion that both China and Russia have quietly supported Iran throughout this conflict, whether through intelligence, sharing, weapons technology, or simply keeping trade routes open despite American pressure. Whether or not every detail of those reports is confirmed, the strategic logic is impossible to ignore. If you were China and you were worried about American military focus shifting toward you in Asia, would you not want the United States trapped in an expensive, drawn-out war somewhere else? This is the part of the story that almost never makes it into mainstream headlines because it's not as dramatic as an airstrike or a missile launch, but it might be the most important consequence of this entire war. The global balance of power was already shifting away from American dominance years before this conflict even began. This war didn't cause that shift, but it may be accelerating it faster than anyone expected. Now let's talk about Israel, because its position in all of this is arguably the most dangerous of all. Remember, this war began as a joint operation between the United States and Israel. Both countries went in with a shared list of goals, removing Iran's ability to enrich uranium, dismantling its ballistic missile program, cutting off its support for allied groups across the region, and in the most ambitious scenarios, triggering a change in Iran's leadership entirely. As of right now, none of those goals have been fully achieved. Iran's nuclear program has been damaged, certainly, but not eliminated. Its ballistic missile capabilities have taken hits, but continue to be used in active strikes. Its regional network of allied groups remains active, even if weakened. And instead of regime collapse, Iran installed a new supreme leader and continued fighting. For Israel specifically, this creates an almost impossible situation. The Iranian nuclear question is the single issue Israeli leadership treats as an absolute red line, a threat they have said for years they will not allow to become reality. If diplomatic paths fail to permanently close that door, some analysts warn there is a real risk that Israel could consider far more extreme options to prevent Iran from ever reaching that threshold. That is not a comfortable thought. It's not meant to be. This is a war where every path forward carries serious risk, and pretending otherwise does a disservice to how dangerous this moment actually is. At the same time, cracks are showing in the relationship between Washington and Tel Aviv. Israel has reportedly pushed back against American willingness to negotiate any deal that leaves Iran's capabilities partially intact. The United States, meanwhile, is dealing with mounting economic pressure, global backlash, and a president who is now openly talking about canceling strikes in favor of a deal. Two allies that started this war with identical goals are now finding themselves with different levels of patience for how it ends. If this deep dive is opening your eyes to just how complicated this war really is, do me a quick favor. Tap that share button and send this to one person who only knows the headline version of this story. This conversation deserves to reach more people who actually want the full picture. Now let's talk about the human and economic cost, because numbers on a screen can only tell part of the story. Since the war began in February, the toll on ordinary people has been staggering. Shipping through the Strait of Hormuz has been disrupted for months, and that disruption has not stayed contained to the Middle East. Fuel prices have swung wildly across the globe. Merchant ships have been damaged, sunk, or seized outright. Seafarers, ordinary workers just trying to do their jobs, have been killed in a conflict that had nothing to do with them personally. Protests against this war have broken out across the world, from Pakistan to Kenya to the Philippines, some of them turning violent, with dozens of reported deaths tied to demonstrations far from the actual battlefield. This war has reached into countries that share no border with Iran, no direct stake in the outcome, and yet their citizens are the ones absorbing tear gas and rubber bullets over a conflict decided by leaders thousands of miles away. And inside Iran itself, the human cost has been enormous. Beyond the military casualties, There have been widespread reports of anti-regime protests met with harsh crackdowns, arrests of demonstrators, including reports involving minors caught up in the unrest. The war has not just been fought against an external enemy. In many ways, it has intensified internal tensions that were already simmering inside Iranian society long before the first missile was launched. This is the part of the story that gets lost when people talk about war in terms of strategy and geopolitics. Behind every headline about a blockade or a strike or a ceasefire, there are hospitals running out of supplies. There are families uncertain if the next drone attack will hit their neighborhood. There are dialysis patients in conflict zones nearby, like Gaza, losing access to critical medical supplies because warehouses storing them have been destroyed in related regional violence. War doesn't stay contained to soldiers and generals. It bleeds into every corner of daily life for millions of people who never asked for any of this. So where does this leave us? Right now, today, on the 2nd of August, 2026, the honest answer is nobody knows for certain. But the pattern is becoming impossible to ignore. Every time this war seems close to a decisive turning point, it doesn't turn. It stalls. It pauses. It restarts. Trump declares victory, and weeks later, new strikes are being planned. A memorandum promises peace within 60 days, and within weeks, it collapses. Strikes are called off, citing progress in talks, even as drones are being shot down over Kuwait on the very same day. This is not what victory looks like. This is what exhaustion looks like, dressed up in the language of progress. And here's the uncomfortable truth that very few people in positions of power are willing to say out loud. Wars like this rarely end with a flag raised and a parade. They end quietly, in negotiating rooms, with both sides finding just enough language to call it a win, even when neither side actually got what they originally wanted. If the United States eventually signs off on a deal that leaves Iran's core capabilities intact, that allows Tehran to maintain influence over the Strait, that stops short of the regime change originally promised, that will not be framed as a loss. It will be framed as a strategic resolution, a mission accomplished, a return to stability. The words will change. The outcome, for anyone paying close attention, will tell a very different story. We saw this exact pattern before, in a much larger and much longer war. Decades ago, the United States entered a conflict in Vietnam with confidence that its military superiority would guarantee a swift victory. It did not go that way. The war dragged on for years, cost enormous resources, and ended in a withdrawal that many historians still describe honestly as a strategic defeat. And yet, remarkably, that outcome did not end American global power. Years later, its greatest rival at the time collapsed entirely, and the United States emerged as the world's dominant superpower anyway. That history matters here because it tells us something important. Even if this war in Iran ends the way many analysts fear, without a clean American victory, that alone will not determine the future of global power. What will determine it is what happens next. How the United States responds to this moment, how it rebuilds trust with allies who felt exposed, how it manages its long-term rivalry with China, and how honestly its leadership is willing to speak about what actually happened here. Before we get to the ending, one more thing. If you want more breakdowns like this, ones that go beyond the headlines and actually connect the dots between events most people treat as separate stories, subscribe now and ring that notification bell. This channel is built for people who refuse to settle for the surface-level version of the news. Let's finish this. So, back to the question we opened with. Has Donald Trump quietly admitted defeat in this war? He hasn't said those words. No president ever does. But look at the actions. Instead of the language, canceling planned strikes at the exact moment officials were preparing them, framing a pause as progress toward a deal, rather than continuing to push for the total victory once promised, watching the State Department warn American citizens to leave. The region, even as the commander-in-chief, speaks the language of diplomacy. These are not the moves of a side that believes it is winning. These are the moves of a side searching for the most dignified way out of a war that has not gone the way it expected. Iran, meanwhile, continues to hold the one card that has defined this entire conflict from the very beginning: control, even partial and contested, over one of the most important waterways on the planet. As long as that leverage remains in Iranian hands, every ceasefire will remain fragile, every deal will remain temporary, and every declaration of victory will remain, at best, premature. This war began with an assassination meant to end a regime in a single night. 5 months later, that regime is still standing, still fighting, and still forcing the most powerful military alliance on Earth back to the negotiating table again and again. Maybe that is the real story here. Not a single dramatic collapse, not a clean winner and a clean loser, but a slow, grinding realization, playing out in real time, that raw military power alone cannot always force the outcome you expect. Sometimes, the side with fewer resources, fewer alliances, and fewer weapons doesn't need to win the war outright. It only needs to survive it, to outlast the other side's patience, its budget, and its political will. If that is what's happening here, then the real question isn't whether Iran can defeat the United States on a battlefield. It's whether the United States can afford to keep fighting a war it can no longer clearly explain how to finish. And that question, more than any missile or any blockade, might be the most dangerous unresolved threat in this entire conflict. If this video helped you understand what's really happening behind the headlines, that's exactly why this channel exists. Like it, share, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one, where we keep asking the questions everyone else is too afraid to ask.